Maybe it wasn't the devil who stole your faith that night. Maybe it wasn't trauma or loss or the crushing weight of unanswered prayers. Maybe it was just you, standing in that darkness, finally admitting what you'd been whispering to yourself for months. I can't do this anymore. And maybe that moment, that brutal, honest moment when you stopped pretending to believe, maybe that was the most sacred thing you'd ever done. Tonight, we're not praying for the strong. We're not lifting up those whose faith burns bright and steady. Tonight, we're praying for the ones who gave up, the ones who walked away, the ones who said goodbye to God because holding on was slowly killing them from the inside. This is for the night you surrendered, the night you stopped fighting, the night you finally let go of everything you thought you knew about faith, hope, and divine love. I know that night. I've lived that darkness. I remember the exact moment when my knees hit the floor, not in worship, but in defeat. When every prayer felt like shouting into an empty room. When silence became God's cruelest answer. You probably told yourself you were protecting your heart, that walking away was survival, that maybe God would understand your absence better than your anger, that maybe leaving was the kindest thing you could do for Him and for you. You were wrong, but you were also completely right. Jesus, I come to you tonight carrying the weight of surrender. Not the beautiful surrender the saints write about, the ugly kind, the kind that tastes like defeat and sounds like a door slamming shut. I come for every soul who has ever looked up at the stars and felt absolutely nothing. For every person who has sat in church feeling like a fraud. For every heart that has beaten the rhythm of I can't, until it became a funeral march for their own faith. Lord, you know the night I'm talking about, the night when hope felt like a luxury I could no longer afford, when trust became a word that tasted like ash in my mouth, when love, even your love, felt like another weight I couldn't carry. That night, I didn't just doubt you. I divorced you. I packed up my prayers, boxed up my expectations, and walked away from everything I thought we had together. Because staying was killing me. Because believing was breaking me. Because loving you hurt more than I could bear. But here's what I didn't know then. What if that night wasn't my failure? What if it was my freedom? What if the moment I stopped trying to be the perfect believer, I finally became real enough for you to reach? Holy Spirit, breathe into this confession. Sometimes the most honest prayer is no prayer at all. Sometimes the truest worship is walking away when staying would be a lie. Sometimes love means admitting you're too broken to love back right now. You see, I thought faith meant never letting go. I thought trust meant never questioning. I thought love meant never needing space. But that night, that dark, desperate night when I gave up, I learned something the church never taught me. Sometimes you call us into the wilderness not to test our faith, but to strip us of everything that isn't faith, everything that's just religious performance, everything that's just spiritual pride, wearing the mask of devotion. And in that stripping, in that brutal honesty, when I could no longer pretend to believe, something extraordinary happened. The God I'd been trying so hard to please, the God I'd been failing so spectacularly, that God stepped aside, and in His place stood someone I'd never met before. The God who loves broken things. the God who draws near to the defeated, the God who whispers, "Finally," when we stop pretending and start bleeding. Father, for everyone listening tonight who has ever felt too far gone, too broken, too angry, too tired to come home, this prayer is your invitation, not to come back perfect, not to come back fixed, but to come back real. Because the night you gave up, that wasn't the end of your story. That was the beginning of your testimony. That was the moment your faith stopped being something you performed and started being something you survived. The scars on your belief don't disqualify you from love. They are proof that you fought for something sacred. They are evidence that you took faith seriously enough to grieve its loss. They are the marks of someone who loved God enough to be honest about the pain. And here's the truth no one tells you. God wasn't absent the night you gave up. He was present in the giving up. He was in the honest tears. He was in the brutal admission. He was in the final surrender. Because sometimes surrender is the only prayer that can break through our pride, our performance, our need to have it all figured out. Jesus, for every person whose faith feels like wreckage tonight, let them know that you specialize in resurrection, that you're not intimidated by their darkness, that you're not shocked by their anger, that you're not disappointed by their doubt. Let them know that the God they couldn't find in their perfect prayers is often found in their broken silence, that the love they couldn't feel in their disciplined devotion often floods in through the cracks of their surrender. And if there's anyone listening who's living in that night right now, who's in the middle of giving up, who's walking away, who's done pretending they're okay with how silent heaven feels, this is your permission to stop performing. This is your invitation to be real. This is your reminder that God isn't fragile enough to be broken by your honesty or distant enough to miss your pain. Because sometimes the most powerful prayer isn't "your will be done." Sometimes it's "I can't do this anymore." Sometimes it's "I don't understand you." Sometimes it's "I love you, but I need space to figure out what that even means." And maybe God has been waiting for that prayer all along. So tonight, I declare this over every broken believer. Your giving up didn't disqualify you from grace. It qualified you for mercy. Your walking away didn't end your relationship with God. It began your journey toward authenticity. Your dark night of the soul wasn't God's rejection. It was God's invitation to meet Him without pretense. The night you gave up was not your failure. It was your freedom. It was the night you stopped trying to be who you thought God wanted and started becoming who He created. It was the night your faith died so it could be resurrected into something real. If this prayer found you in your darkness tonight, don't let it end in silence. In the comments below, write, "I gave up." If you've ever walked away from faith and found God waiting for you there, write "still fighting" if you're in that dark night right now and need us to pray with you. Because your story, your broken, beautiful, honest story, is exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. Your testimony of God's love in the aftermath of giving up might be the very thing that gives someone else permission to be real about their own struggle. Share this prayer if you know someone who's living in that night tonight. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is remind each other that God isn't afraid of our darkness. He's been waiting for us there all along. The night you gave up, the night you walked away, the night you said goodbye to everything you thought you knew about God, that night wasn't your ending, it was your beginning. And maybe tonight, as you listen to these words, you're realizing something beautiful. The God you couldn't find when you were trying so hard to believe, He never stopped believing in you.